For a very long time, I've had an extremely disruptive agenda regarding the whole field of metaphysics and what has been called metaphysical sciences by the University of Metaphysical Sciences, which I earned a PhD from, and they use a different nomenclature for some of their PhDs, different from mainstream schools. So my PhD, even though it traditionally stands for Philosophiae Doctore, or Doctor of Philosophy, my PhD signifies that I'm a philosopher of metaphysics, which is interesting because metaphysics is a specific branch in philosophy itself, and actually comes from one of the ancient biographers of Aristotle, gave it that name, as some books that followed Aristotle's Physica meaning nature, and Metaphysica, or the things that come after nature. Or some ways it can be said is that physics or nature are the things that change, and metaphysics are the things that do not change. And it's evolved in many ways. Metaphysics are the underlying structure of reality, and oftentimes it's equated with or thought of to be synonymous with the study of consciousness itself. But my agenda, which I have been highly motivated to pursue for a long time and feel like I've accomplished, is I actually wanted to hack my PhD. And what I mean by that is that I wanted to do something with the intentions of basically for writing as close as I possibly could, or was capable of, a physics paper, and sneak it into getting a metaphysical degree, so that my PhD would have been earned really in physics. That was one of the plans that I had. Now, I didn't exactly accomplish that, but what I did is actually pretty astonishing, and I consider to be a great accomplishment, which is my thesis, which is called Eternal Echoes, Metaphysical Inquiry into the Fate of the Universe. It positions itself at the intersection of cosmology and metaphysics. So basically, the origin, or how the universe started and possibly how it will end, that's the inquiry into the fate of the universe, and the philosophy about that, asking questions about it. And so that is the approach that I took, is that I wanted to have a paper that was deeply entrenched in science while being a paper that was written for a metaphysical institution. And so in a way, if you can think about it this way, this is just a more extreme example, but it would be like if, and you know what just came to my mind, so free association, I'm just going to use this example, how Amy Farrah Fowler from the TV show The Big Bang Theory, how she won the Nobel Prize in Physics even though she is a neuroscientist, right? So that it's the equivalent of something like that. I basically snuck in a cosmology paper into a metaphysical school simply by looking at it from a philosophical lens and just asking questions about all of the latest findings in cosmology, which is basically the study of how the universe began and what might be its fate. And so, you know, a lot of that deals with physics, and specifically a lot of astrophysics gets thrown around in there. But it does have a really, I found it to be a really good field to study that leans very heavily a lot of times on philosophy. And you see a lot of this when you look at things, people who are studying cosmology or fundamental forces like Einstein and the questions that they ask, or people like Greene, who has been a string theorist. You know, if you don't know what that is, it's a branch of theoretical physics that posits that the fundamental units of the universe, the fundamental units are not the point particles that we know of, like electrons or quarks or photons or those things, but they're actually vibrating strings of energy, and that they're so small we can't detect them. But by the frequency that they vibrate, they give rise to the fundamental particles. And some of them are open strings, has been said, and some of them are closed. Like, so, you know, some are like a piece of spaghetti, some are like a rubber band. You could look at it like that, right? Or a cut. Some of them are a closed rubber band, some are a cut rubber band, stretched rubber band. So or it could be looked at as some are standing waves and some, right? So, and some are moving, traveling waves. So that's part of string theory. And so this is a good segue to the reason why I thought of even doing that in the first place. And I talk about this, or I discuss this in the opening of the thesis paper. And it's because I was heavily influenced by theoretical physics, specifically string theory, right around the time when I was starting to experience a lot of information about metaphysics and even really knowing what that was in the first place. I was first introduced to a lot of metaphysics in 1997, around after I graduated from high school in 1996, and I was reading and pouring myself into a lot of books. And so I'll say this first. This is also a very important side note, and I feel that this is a very important thing for people to understand, and it may inform a lot of the reasons why I've done many of the things I have, and also serve as an inspiration to show people that there is never really any correct way to do things, or one correct way to do things, just as long as you're not doing anything that's hurting other people. I believe in operating from the laws of mutual exchange and engaging only in transactions that benefit all whom it affects as much as possible, right? And with no ill intention. Just go about doing your best to improve yourself. And so there was an example that I had just recently, just this year, I saw that there were a bunch of episodes of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. And so I just started binge watching that while I was writing. I'm writing a couple of novels right now, and I would have it on in the background to listen. And in a lot of ways, it's because of one of the main reasons that I consume media is to learn. And I also like to laugh, and the show is actually pretty funny. And so it's actually a really great way to get in my current events. I mean, I caught up with a lot of stuff I had no idea about simply by watching or listening to that show in the background. And so one of the things I learned was a good example for something that's been on my mind for a while, but I really didn't take the time to formulate any way of how to express it. And this how it happens with me very often. I derive a lot of things and use them to express myself for ideas that I have, but I don't necessarily have the language yet to express it, simply because I just think about things, and sometimes I assign my own nomenclature to it, or I just move on and let it sit in my mind until it finally just, erupts from within me. It can't stay down anymore. Like when I was thinking a lot about the mechanisms of how hypnosis works, and then eventually I came across all of this different information in mirror neurons and visual motor behavior rehearsal and neuroplasticity, and then I developed a term called neural subactivation, and then realized later that there is a term already in neuroscience called subthreshold activation. So, but going back to again, this example, which I think is really important of why I approach things in a certain way. Now I'll get back to Greene, which I was about to address, of why I even approached metaphysics in the way that I did. But this informs why I even looked at education in the way that I did. And so this example from John Oliver is that he was talking about how, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm preserving the core understanding of what this story actually is, that there was a young kid, I believe African American, who was being creative and decided to make a mock-up of a Molotov cocktail. And so he used some household cleaners or chemicals which weren't dangerous. It wasn't like he was making chloroform, which you can do with household chemicals. But he just put some liquids in a bottle, and he put a piece of toilet paper under the cap. So it was a mock Molotov cocktail. And so he got in trouble. He got arrested and charged with having a dangerous weapon, which it was none of those things. It was not a Molotov cocktail at all. It was basically a prop. And another kid heard about it and said, oh, I did the same thing. But what happened with him, according to Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, is that his schedule was rearranged because they thought, oh, wow, he might be a future chemist or something like that. So they rearranged his schedule to put him into chemistry classes to help to support his creativity in chemistry, because he made a mock Molotov cocktail. And so let's nurture that part of him, and he has this curiosity to be a chemist, and so he didn't get arrested, suspended, charged, nothing, just his schedule rearranged so that he could get extra support to nurture this possibly budding curiosity to explore chemistry, because of the fact that he made a mock Molotov cocktail. So see, the difference is what John Oliver tonight and what people were saying about that is that because of his race, he was discriminated against, arrested, charged, and almost had his life ruined, while another one was given a chance to improve his life by doing the same thing. So different people are treated a different way. We already know that and understand that. Now, I lived through that. However, I didn't know what it was, and I didn't understand why I had the experiences that I did in relation to other people. Like, so for example, I had a girlfriend who would question things that I did, or why would you do that? And, how come you don't know about this? It's because it wasn't around me in my environment. I wasn't raised by that, nor did my teachers or guidance counselors nurture my curiosities. They actually ignored it and many times suppressed it whenever I would show curiosity in things. It's not, when I was writing all these lyrics and practicing martial arts and exploring math and science, they didn't nurture it. Nobody encouraged me to go further in science. Nobody told me anything about studying harder in science, or, you have a knack for mathematics. One of my friends said that I'm better at math than anybody he knows. And this was demonstrable throughout school, and also with reading, my reading comprehension and my diction, my reading comprehension, my articulation, my everything. There were so many things that I was operating at a very high level, but it wasn't nurtured. Meanwhile, other people were given these opportunities and these work school programs and all this other stuff that they were told about, and I wasn't. And unfortunately, my parents weren't highly educated, so they didn't have the perspective to lead me in any of those directions either. So, of course, that's why you hope when you send your children to school that the adults around them that you are leaving them in these people's care would see these things, because they're teachers. That's why they got into the business, to nurture the curiosities of students, that they would find these things, which they do, but only with certain people. And then I would learn these things that my parents couldn't provide. That's part of the purpose of school, is you have these teachers who've gone to college, who've had some education, whether it's a bachelor's, master's, or PhD, and which confers upon them different privileges and how they can teach, whether it be elementary school, high school, or university, right? That these people should, from wherever they are, be able to nurture these various different curiosities in the students, children, and help them to be better than perhaps their parents were. A lot of immigrants moved to the United States for that, and so my parents were immigrants from Trinidad. And so, but again, I wasn't nurtured in that way, and I was treated differently. And in hindsight, I can actually see it's because of my brown skin color. And it's happened over and over again. And I actually have a parallel story to that one with the Molotov cocktail. Although I actually did create functional weapons, but another person that was with me did as well. So the story is, so basically I learned how to make my own nunchaku and tri-sectional staffs, and also this very interesting form of a projectile weapon. Anyway, I had a bunch of them in my backpack. The school resource officer, Officer Campbell, I remember from the Fort Lauderdale Police, who was a mean and crazy racist. And, I'm putting his name out there. I'm saying that he's probably long retired. But he found these things on me and my friend. And he he tried to charge me, get me arrested, suspended, all this other stuff. Meanwhile, my friend Mike, he let him off. He just basically took his stuff, and they confiscated all my stuff in my bag. And by the way, it wasn't even during school hours. It was after school, and we just happened to be walking through the campus at Fort Lauderdale High School for some reason. We were doing something, and the school was closed. They had other different things going on. I think there was like some girl on the swim team that we thought was really cute. Actually, yeah, it was. It was a girl who played trumpet, and she was also on the swim team, and we thought she was hot. So we went to go watch a swim meet, and then we walked off the back of the campus, and Officer Campbell stopped us. Why are we here? Blah, blah, blah. And then all of that ensued. And later on, Mike got put into wood shop because it was reported, and they told somebody, our teachers or whatever, and they're like, oh, you like to make stuff like that. Well, wood shop, because that was the big thing at the time. I remember there was the wood shop, and I didn't get that opportunity until sometime later. Then I started asking about it, and then I had a very brief stint in wood shop, but then didn't end up staying in the class for whatever reason. But that's just one example. I think it might have been because I dropped out of school for a year, went to California for a little while, and then came back and then switched schools and went to Northeast High School. But I've illustrated my point there that's actually a real phenomenon. And it's related in a way to representation in media and things like that as well. But you know what? I'm going to pause on that. That's a whole nother explanation that I don't want to get into. What I'm going to circle back to now is that there were a lot of opportunities that were suppressed or hidden from me, or through sins of omission, I was not given the advantages of those types of pathways for various different reasons. And so when I did finally graduate from high school, also late, I had to go to summer school and do 2 very low-level science and math classes, which also shouldn't have been that way, considering my math and science curiosities and inherent skill. But that's what I did. And I went to summer school, and I graduated high school, got my high school diploma. And so what I did was I continued something that I've always been interested in, which was reading. I remember some of the earliest books that really got me captivated with reading. Was a book, one of them is called The Last Mission by Harry Mazer. And then I was really into the Choose Your Own Adventure books. And I remember there was one called The Lost Tribe about the Maori in New Zealand. And I remember even details like how they called the white man Pakeha. And there was another one, I forget what it was, but it was an alien story. And, on and on. I just loved reading. So when high school was done and I wasn't caught up with all of that, I was also in a death metal band for a little while during my last final high school year and a little bit into 1996. But so I just kept on reading. And one of the first books, I started reading all these books. Like I remember seeing The Millionaire Next Door. I do remember when it first came out, Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad came out. And because of reading books like those, it was in the same section where you have the now very controversial author Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. And I say that because I was kind of put onto it a long time ago by Dan Kennedy when he was wondering why was it that Napoleon Hill died penniless and alone, whereas another man, W. Clement Stone, took his principles and became phenomenally rich. And it turns out that Napoleon Hill, that wasn't his real name, and he was actually really a con artist and had a different name and was really violent with the women he was involved with and all this other stuff. But another story for another day. But I was totally into all of these books and reading and learning, was curious, and I was one of those people who got caught up in the hype of wow, you can get rich and these books can teach you how to do that. And that was a huge interest of mine. And then a lot of them were these metaphysical books that were, you could kind of call them, I don't think there's an official category of this, but a lot of it was that prosperity gospel, where these people were intertwining spirituality with how you can make money, and it's all about the more moral you are and good, and thoughts become things, but with gratitude and all of these other things that they were and were basically reeling you in with money and then wrapping it in this new age metaphysical new thought, which is a completely different metaphysics than I am concerned with here. But just, I'm giving this background. It's actually very important to understand this and understand this idea of metaphysics and where I am and how I've actually, hacked my degree and why I did it. And there's a lot to unpack in this, and it's definitely very informative and will show and sow a lot of seeds to various different forms of success in a person's life. So that was my interest, was reading, and I felt like I was learning a lot, and also I was improving a lot of different parts of my life and gaining new perspectives from reading. So I was definitely learning a lot. It was also helping me to have a different vocabulary with which to speak to certain people, and it opened a lot of doors for me, just having a completely different language to talk about things because of, Rich Dad, Poor Dad and The Millionaire Next Door and various books like that. There were just so many different ways of expressing myself that were embedded in these books that I wouldn't have had if I didn't read them. So now let's fast forward through all of that. Sometime later, I'd worked in film and TV and moved to California, and then in 2004 I had already earned a certificate to be a personal trainer, and then a year before that in 2003, and then found a job as a trainer at this place called Bodies in Motion in 2004. And then very shortly after that, as I kept on just pursuing things, I enrolled in the Hypnosis Motivation Institute to start earning my diploma in clinical hypnosis. And that school is very interesting in being the first nationally accredited college of hypnosis, and also having the curriculum that they had, which mainly focused on clinical hypnosis for lay practitioners, under the scope of practice being vocational and avocational motivation and self-improvement. But they had a lot of different courses in there. Like there were definitely, I know that there were elective courses, there were Reiki courses. One of the teachers, Michelle Guzzi, was doing like past life regression. They had other things that were more like executive. They had NLP courses. There were all kinds of workshops on guided imagery. Cheryl, something or other, I can't remember. She did some stuff like that. My mentor, Elaine Perlis. So everybody, there was a wide variety of different things that were going on at the school. And so there was a good amount of woo-woo and new age and new thought stuff mixed in there, because there's definitely a very thick overlap with hypnosis and a lot of the new age, new thought. You think about, thoughts become things, philosophies. There's a lot of overlap in a lot of these things there. So, and it just so happened that at the time, my roommate Kevin, who let me move in with him, I had met him at University of Miami. I wasn't a student there, but a young lady that I met when I was an extra on this movie called Any Given Sunday in Miami. She was a student there at University of Miami. She was in film school, and Kevin was one of her friends, and I met him. And so then her and I moved to California with her. We broke up. Kevin had moved there a little bit later. He actually stayed with us for a couple of months before he got his own place. Then when I broke up with her, I moved in with him. And one of the things that was really awesome about Kevin was that he really enjoyed documentaries and learning and education. So he would, some of them were fringe stuff, but it was very cool. He had a huge collection and a very eclectic and widely varying taste in a lot of things. So he had like full collections of like unsolved mysteries, or various different, he would have collections of horror movies. And we watched so many different films together. And then he even he worked for a while at the ArcLight Cinemas, and I used to go watch movies there and everything like that. And, we lived in Hollywood, so it was pretty cool. So I moved in with him, and one of the things, and this is also, I wrote about this in, like I said in the opening, there's a whole personal relevance section and introduction to the thesis that they have as part of what's outlined at the University of Metaphysical Sciences. And so I talked about how, he found this this DVD set of The Elegant Universe that was hosted by Brian Greene, who was the author of a book by the same name. And so this DVD collection, I didn't see it. Kevin got it around 2004 is when I watched it. I believe when I looked it up, it was actually released in 2003 on PBS. And it was like Nova was a special program on PBS, I think, that focused on science. I'm not sure, but I do know that the name Nova is in there, and it was on PBS. And The Elegant Universe, the book, was written by the theoretical physicist Brian Greene, who specializes in string theory. It was originally published in 1999. So here I am, 5 years later, getting the video version of it. And I remember being so fascinated by this that I would just watch it over and over again. And Kevin, sometimes he would come in, he'd say, "You're watching that again?" Like, he just was so surprised, because I would be watching it and I would be taking notes, and I would be writing things down and pulling out different pieces of information and certain analogies and things that Brian Greene and other people that were in the production with him were talking about. And I was just committing these things to memory. And I remember learning so much from that. And then at that same year, a film came out called What the Bleep Do We Know? And that had a physicist named Fred Allen Wolf in it. And it was hosted by an actress that I had seen before, Marlee Maitland. And it was really great production. I remember my first introduction to a guy named Stuart Hameroff, who was a medical doctor, was in it, I don't know if he was doing it at the time, maybe he was, but I later learned he partnered with Roger Penrose, who I actually wrote about both of that with their OR, their orchestrated reduction, their theory about how there's a collapse of the wave function in the microtubules in the brain, and that is where consciousness comes from. So it was a very fascinating thing to see the string theory, and how Brian Greene was talking about how the universe is stranger than we think, and it was also a really great physics primer, because he went through history. He talked about Newton, he talked about Einstein, he talked about Clerk Maxwell. It was really great, and the graphics, and there was so much amazing information packed into this series. I think it came in 3 parts, but I watched it over and over and over again. I mean, there are things that I learned from there about the electromagnetic spectrum. One really cool example for that they talked about was how the electromagnetic spectrum and what we see, red, orange, Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. How that's a very, very small part of the actual electromagnetic spectrum of light. And he described it as if you took a roll of film and you started it at the southernmost point of California and rolled it all the way up to the northernmost point of Washington State, that our visible spectrum would only be one frame of that film out of all those thousands of miles. One tiny frame, one little slit, one line. And that was fascinating to me. And that turned me onto the idea that there's a whole world out there that we're not seeing. And, of course, that many other living creatures on Earth see in different parts of the spectrum. So they can see infrared, ultraviolet, and all those kind of things, right? So it was just really, really fascinating to have that perspective, and then to, as I said, be introduced to what the bleep do we know, and have these physicists and all these other philosophers and these people talking about it. It was a great production. I thought the production value of both of them, and they had similar formats, that there was a good part of, there were the talking heads part and people talking about their ideas intermingled with dramatic scenes here and there, and, other types of, infographic types of things. It was just amazing. And all the while, I'm going to the Hypnosis Motivation Institute and from 2004, and I should have graduated, because I started in November 4th of 2004, and I should have graduated around November of 2005, but I had some issues. I started dating a woman I shouldn't have, who worked at the school, and I let it emotionally disturb me a little bit, even though I broke up with her. And then I didn't graduate finally until February of 2006. And by that time, I don't know if it had already come out already or if it was later that year, but then Rhonda Byrne's The Secret had come out. And so now here's the lineage here that I was exposed to. I was exposed to theoretical physics with Brian Greene's string theory, which I had never even heard of before, but he also primed me and gave me a great overview of physics in general. And, classical physics and quantum mechanics, and then string theory. So I learned about 3 different perspectives of physics from that docuseries. So again, I learned about classical mechanics, quantum mechanics, and string theory. It was amazing. And there was so much packed into that. And then getting exposed to a little bit of the new age and the woo-woo and the consciousness stuff from What the Bleep Do We Know, and having Fred Alan Wolf, and I think a guy named John Hagelin was in it also, who was a physicist. And there were several other people in there as well. Who else do I remember from there very clearly from What the Bleep Do We Know that were particularly fascinating? I'm sure that it will come to me. However, my point is that there were physicists in that. And remember, the formats were similar, intermingled with the infographics and the dramatic scenes and the talking head stuff. So they had this similar feel. The production quality and value was high. And, you had all those really cool wavy, it was just, they were beautifully done. And so then, I graduate, and I also had some pretty amazing experiences using hypnosis in that time. And then The Secret comes out. And I think Fred Alan Wolf was also in that. Maybe even John Hagelin was. And I'm not sure if John Hagelin was in What the Bleep Do We Know, but he was in one or both of those two, just like Fred Alan Wolf was. He was either in The Secret and or What the Bleep Do We Know, or vice versa, right? There was one of them that he was in, and Fred Alan Wolf, the same thing. And so to see that jump, right, from, from accepted mainstream physics of string theory, and then having some also high profile physicists and a medical doctor like I said, Stuart Hameroff, who also worked later with Roger Penrose, who's a Nobel Prize winner, And oh yeah, in What the Bleep Do We Know is when I was first introduced to Dean Radin. That's who I was thinking of. To Dean Radin from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which I would later learn was founded by the sixth man to walk on the moon, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut. So, and just fascinating stuff, right? And I still follow the work of Dean Radin here and there. I look into his stuff and, but so then you have The Secret, and there are physicists in that, and then there's a lot of new people, and a lot of compelling stories, and you've got people talking about thoughts become things. And I had already heard about that we become what we think about type of talk, because in 2003 in California I was recruited into this network marketing company that was at the time called Prepaid Legal, and then became is now Legal Shield. I still use the product, but I'm not a network marketer. But one of the guys, how I was on his team, the upline of my upline, if you know that jargon of network marketing, he was very much into personal development. His name is Sean Michael, or Shiran Michael, and in his garage, I went over there. He lived in his parents' garage at the time, and he was burning CDs for us. And I remember two of the main ones that I listened to over and over again that he gave us was a CD called Building Your Network Marketing Business with Jim Rohn, who is a legend in his own right. And the other one was a 1956 recording from Earl Nightingale called The Strangest Secret. And I remember very clearly Earl Nightingale, the way he said it. He says, now listen, he says, now the next thing I'm going to say is like, will change your life if you really understand it. And he says, we become what we think about. Now let me say that again. We become what we think about. And then he goes on and says that all the philosophers and, and everybody, they disagree on all this stuff, but they agree in unanimous decision on this one thing, that we become what we think about. So that stuck with me. And now, then the next year, 2004, Hypnosis Motivation Institute, The Elegant Universe, What the Bleep Do We Know? Then I graduate 2006, and then here comes The Secret, and it's all this consciousness stuff, and then there's also physicists in it. So I'm wrapped up in this, and then I learned that maybe Rhonda Byrne's The Secret was influenced by Wallace D. Wattles' The Science of Getting Rich. And I had already been introduced to the science of mind. So there's all the science and secrets, right? And then I read Wallace D. Wattles, and he talked about the ether. And then I remember reading James Clerk Maxwell's treatise on electricity and magnetism, and he talked about the luminiferous ether at the end of that. And so, I'm wrapped up in all of this. And then at some point in time, around then, like either 2007 or so, maybe it was 2006, because I know it took me a while before I got the money together. But I remember that down the street, there was a place called Into the Mystic, I think is what it was called. And that was either the name of that, but I remember this woman named Goddess Tawhida had a place too. I don't know if her place was called Into the Mystic, or if Into the Mystic was the metaphysical bookshop. But either way, it was just like a quarter a block away, because I remember at the corner there was a coffee shop called the Coffee Bean, and then there were other stores and strips in between that and the Hypnosis Motivation Institute on Ventura Boulevard. And there was a metaphysical shop, and they had books, and I was obsessed with books. And I remember going in there, and there were flyers for the University of Metaphysical Sciences. And so here, my brain, not really knowing much about this, I see metaphysical sciences. And what sticks out to me is physics, physical, and sciences. And so having been introduced and fascinated by theoretical physics, and the physicists in What the Bleep Do We Know, and the physicists that were also in The Secret, I was primed to go for that. And it had this beautiful lavender colored brochure, or violet colored, whatever. I like lavender because that's one of my favorite oils to use. But I like lavender. So I saw that, and I flipped through the brochure, and I thought, man, I could do, wow, you can get your bachelor's, master's, and PhD in metaphysics. And I thought, and I looked at the price, and I was like, wow, I could, this is kind of doable. And, it was study at your own pace. It was completely online. They would send you materials. So I remember I did get a bunch of physical materials, which I still have in a storage unit in California. So you get sent these notebooks, ring binders, and CDs of meditations. I mean, all this great coursework. And so I was fascinated, and I'd also already been primed that I could earn a doctorate because I met a woman at a Starbucks in South Miami in Coral Gables, down the street from where University of Miami was, because the previously mentioned friend Kevin, who I met from the girl that I was with at the time, I used to go to the Starbucks there, and I can't remember the woman's name. I think it was Susan or something like that, but she had talked about a program, how she, from her own life experience, that she wrote her thesis and her paper or whatever, and she earned a doctorate, a PhD. I didn't know it was a PhD or whatever it was at the time. I'm assuming it was something like that, but from her life experience, and I don't know what kind of program it was, but it planted that seed that, I could get a higher education from the things that I know and do, and that really stuck with me for a while, like to the fact that I still remember, and this is over 20 years later. Keep in mind, I graduated from HMI in 2006. I started in 2004, so that's 20 years ago that I finished that school. So now, I finally put a down payment at University of Metaphysical Sciences. I remember in 2008 is when I officially started. And just so you know, I actually did not earn my PhD until 2024 for various different reasons, from traveling and doing all this stuff and just doing just various different things, working at a gym, just doing so many different things that happened, and just not being as focused on it as I feel like maybe I could have been. But everything happens for a reason. And I went to China for 4 years. Flor, the love of my life, people use that term all the time, but she really was an amazing person. She passed away in 2019, and then COVID happened right after that. She was in New York visiting her family. I was in China when it happened, and then I couldn't get out of the country, and I got stuck there till 2021. And so then I just started doing a bunch of things again. I used some of the money that I had from teaching or whatever, and I paid off the school, and I finally got my bachelor's, I think, in 2020 or 2020. Yeah, 2020. And then 2022 finished the master's, and then 2024 finished the first doctorate. And I still have another one to do. I don't know if and when, if I'll ever get to it. But again, I know I started this all off, and there was a great reason, and the purpose was to talk about how I hacked the degree. And I feel like I'm going to use this word, but I feel like I've done something revolutionary in a way, because I deviated completely from the curriculum in a lot of ways to write a thesis based on what my interests were, which the closest thing that I could relate to everything that I saw in the elegant universe was basically cosmology, because they were talking about what everything is made out of and what that might mean for the universe. Like, string theory was and is a theoretical physics theory that is attempting to unify gravity, classical mechanics of Einstein, with quantum mechanics. And, throughout the whole entire elegant universe, one of the biggest things they kept on emphasizing was, and I remember the little robot voice, unification, right? And the grand unified theories they were talking about, the gut, and there were so many other things that were in there. I mean, I learned some great things about, Abdus Salam and Harvey Weinberg, and I forget what the other guy's name is. In 1972, they won the Nobel Prize for figuring out that the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, and electricity and magnetism, when you roll back the cosmic clock, were all really one force, and it felt like we were getting closer and closer to unification. So exciting stuff. And so all throughout my studies at the University of Metaphysical Sciences, I started to realize more and more that there was very little to do with physics, and it was more like a lot of New Age, what people would call woo-woo. And even more closely related to, but not exactly to, a lot of the prosperity gospels. But even though a lot of that stuff was they really didn't have prosperity gospels in the University of Metaphysical Sciences, but there's a lot of overlap. But they weren't really talking about money. There's only one course really that talked about, building your metaphysical business or building a metaphysical ministry and all that stuff like that. So there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on money, but they did talk about success and how you could use a degree, as to show your dedication to the field of studying metaphysics for your spiritual unfoldment. That you can put, when you write books and you do seminars, it gives you a little bit more credibility. With the master's degree, you can become an ordained minister or an ordained reverend through the Wisdom of the Heart Church, and which all of that I've done. I chose minister, and although reverend is a different one, minister means more like servant. Reverend is one who's revered. I just took the minister path. Anyway, so all of that was the backdrop of why I wrote the thesis in the way that I did for the University of Metaphysical Sciences. And it really informed what I was doing. And I gave, I talked about that lineage. I talked all about Elegant Universe, What the Bleep Do We Know, The Secret, in the introduction. I didn't really put too much on it. But, in intervening years, I would learn about, for example, I started learning about subquantum kinetics by Paul Elie-Violette. I think it was around 2007 when he had this book called Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. And I really found out about him because another author who was talking about exploding planet hypothesis and gosh, what was his name? And it was what was it called? It was ancient texts and modern physics and Joseph P. Farrell. When he wrote Babylon's Banksters and just some really great books, but he mentioned Paul Elie-Violette in there, and then that's where I learned about the breakaway civilization, and all this stuff was fascinating because the way that Joseph P. Farrell writes and how he shows he cites references in the book it's a very heavily researched, document that you're looking at. So the way that a lot of people were writing and the influences that I had really primed me to want to do what I did, and so that's why my thesis, which on Amazon, I titled it All That Blooms Must Die, Metaphysical Inquiry into the Fate of the Universe, which is based off of a haiku that I wrote in an emotional commentary on how I felt after Flor, F-L-O-R, which means flower in Spanish, when she died in 2019. The poem that I wrote was called Although the Sun Shines Upon Our Perfect Garden, All That Blooms Must Die. And so I took my thesis paper, it's like only 66 pages, and then I turned it into a book, and I just called it All That Blooms Must Die, Eternal Echoes of the Universe, and I have it on Amazon. And I put it there, and I tell people that, hey, if you want to support me and you want to understand certain things, that's a way. Even though you can find it for free, it's on ResearchGate. There's PDFs of it elsewhere, but if you want to support me in some way, you can find it on Amazon. And I did have it for a while on my own boutique bookstore, which I'm going to put it on there again, but I took it down because I didn't like the way it came out the first time. So again, that was my intention and what I did, and I feel like I successfully found that grounding there, because I followed up Eternal Echoes with something called Axiom of Necessity. And so now let me get into why I really did that, because I really didn't touch on my motivations for what was happening there, but I did mention this in the thesis. And so the idea was that I really saw that a lot of people in science, in physics, were claiming that a lot of the people in, metaphysics were all woo-woo, new age, it's all fluff, it's hype, it's not real, it's more philosophy, you can't do anything with it. It doesn't really have any explanatory power, it's not empirical. And so they were dismissing the people in those kind of self-help, personal development fields. And on the other hand, those in the metaphysical side were saying that the people, the scientists and the empiricists, were closed-minded and they didn't know what was really past physics because they just basically started their own new religion and they're stuck in that and they're in a box. And You know, just because, you know, like some people would use the saying that says, you know, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and things like that. And so you just have, and people are fighting, just like the whole science versus religion. That's basically the same thing as what it was. But I did see a certain flaw, because in some ways, what I had learned, or at least what I understood, what I was experiencing, was that a great deal of people who did have this higher education, PhDs in mainstream physics and things like that, a lot of them seemed to be open-minded to the spiritual realm. And so it didn't prohibit them from doing it. So, like, for example, Francis S. Collins, I read his book. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, is a Christian or Catholic, I don't remember, one of the Jesus cults. And so Francis S. Collins, and also, man, there were some other people, Fritjof Capra. There were various other people who had all these mystical experiences. You know, Einstein, he said he believes in Spinoza's God, which is a completely different thing, but that's very close to where my mind is, if you look at my eternality axiom. And so I was looking at it like, well, you know, and I even had a friend who I met at University of Miami named Arissa, who was she worked on the Mars Science Laboratory. She went to MIT after she left University of Miami, and then went to JPL. And, you know, and I even got to go see a play called Pasadena Babylon that she was in. That was really interesting because it had L. Ron Hubbard, Anton Xander LaVey, Aleister Crowley, and stuff that I had learned about when I was also in the Hypnosis Motivation Institute. By the way, I also got heavily involved in the Church of Scientology as an intelligence agent of my own making. I decided to investigate it on my own because I found it fascinating. So I was also influenced by that. And L. Ron Hubbard said things that hypnosis, you want hypnosis in a parlor the same way you want an atom bomb there, saying it's dangerous. He would say things in the book I read like, a motto one could use is never trust a hypnotist. So after all that, I ended up going to school for clinical hypnosis. So there was all this stuff that was just intersecting and crossing over. But the real thing that bugged me was that and the reason why I mentioned Arissa was because she's a Christian. And she, you know, I would go to open mics and karaoke's at the University of Miami, and she'd be there, and I would sing Creed songs. And she was very happy about that because Creed, you know, was a spiritual group, and Scott Stapp, the lead singer, there was some stuff about him being a Christian and growing up in a Christian household, and a lot of his songs were influenced by that. Like, you know, you hear in lyrics go, I cry out to God seeking only his decision. Gabriel stands and confirms I've created my own prison, in the song My Own Prison. So, but I was really heavily influenced by Creed. I really loved the music, and I would sing it all the time at the karaoke on University of Miami campus. So there were a lot of people who were scientists, mainstream scientists, you know, in technology and engineering, basically STEM people, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, who were also religious and spiritual. But it seemed like, to me, that a lot of people on the other side, in the New Age and the metaphysical, were complaining and fussing because they were either too lazy, too stupid, or too close-minded themselves to look at what was happening in physics. Because I feel like if they did, they would see some of the mind-blowing stuff that, for example, Brian Greene was talking about in The Elegant Universe, and then the crossover I saw in What the Bleep Do We Know, and then a lot of stuff in the Secret. It was just, to me, maybe these things just happened very fortuitous to me. I just had a very different understanding than a lot of people did because of the way that I got introduced to the information. Plus, I was already speaking fragments of Latin and into metaphysics and certain crazy spirituality because my father was Catholic, and I got baptized in South Florida. There was a lot of religion, and I went to a lot of churches and youth groups there. But then, I was writing poetry, and then I started writing, and I was in the chorus, and we sang in Italian, in Latin, in German, and in English in school, and I learned some of the translations of what things meant there. Then when I got into the band, the death metal band Acrimonium in 1995, I started writing lyrics for them, and then I started saying things in Latin because I had heard, like, for example, this band, Atrocity from Germany, they had Latin in their music, something like somnium timoris desiderium praeterium maestitium, something like that. And they were doing stuff like that. So I put some Latin in the lyrics of Acrimonium. And then there were a lot of, anti-Christian and satanic themes. And so I was all mixed up into this multi-linguistic, anti-Christian, religious rebellion, all this stuff. And then the lyrics from all these different bands. And I had already been, listening to Rage Against the Machine and Sepultura. And then that was also a bridge into, System of a Down, which all had political and social commentary. So all these things were floating around in my head, being a lyricist and a vocalist and a presenter and a speaker. And I did all of those things. But the problem that I saw was that I felt that the people in the spiritual side were more closed-minded for some reason. And they were saying things like, the scientists, they don't understand this. They're too closed-minded and they don't know about this other stuff. But what I really saw was that if the people in the spiritual metaphysical side, before they could say that, because again, there were some really amazing things that were being talked about in string theory, and string theory still remains something that's untestable. And even one of the speakers and right now it's just not coming to my mind who it is, but I did quote him in my thesis. But he says, at the distances and energies that, these strings are supposed to be, he says, we'll never test them. He says, so the theory is safe, permanently safe. He says, is that a theory of physics or philosophy? I ask you, right? And so that question was there. And I put, that's in my thesis too, because it's a valid question. And however, I feel like that if people were more informed on basic fundamental science, then and only then can they really be informed on whether or not physics and the highest forms of theoretical sciences are talking about any of these things, because a lot of them are. And questions of consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality are parts of those conversations. If you look at people like Sean Carroll and and even Brian Greene is very open-minded. If you look at his talks with like World Science Fair and things, or World Science Festival, right? Like he's a very open-minded guy. And so I developed this framework called the meta framework, which I feel like I'm so clever about it because of metaphysics. So my metaphysics is multivariant. It's not only the metaphysics of the University of Metaphysical Sciences, which Christine Brees, the founder, she has dozens of CDs with angel meditations, and there's courses on UFOs, and with what David Greer, I think is his name, who with CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, who teaches that. There's courses on witchcraft. There's sacred sexuality. There, all these different things, right? But it's really more of that. It's on that meditative, angelic, beautiful forces side, like, it has that vibe, which I'm going to comment on. Eventually, I'm going to make a recording about the Breath of Fire documentary about yoga, because I've also started teaching yoga in 2004, and I do have a lot to say about that. So I'm just putting that out there right now. I'm going to actually do that soon. But it had that same kind of vibe. It was like, these people who talked in these soft, breathy, sultry tones, and we're so spiritual, and things like that. And some of the stuff kind of like, I was like, I'm not really into it. But it's also, I wanted to be a maverick. I wanted to stand out. I wanted it so that when I became Dr. Hakeem Ali-Bocas Alexander, PhD, that my thesis was completely different than anything anybody else did, but still qualified as a metaphysical thesis. And I succeeded in doing that. And the meta framework that I developed, and I only really touched upon it a little bit there, was an acronym for META, which I felt were the four main pillars of physics, which is mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics. So as I was saying, my physics is multivariant. It's the Aristotelian metaphysics, which again, Aristotle did not coin the term metaphysics. One of his biographers did, to talk about the books of the things that do not change. He called it metaphysics. But so some of that Aristotelian metaphysics from that time, also the metaphysics of Spinoza, Hegel, Descartes, Schopenhauer, which is very closely and influenced the metaphysics of Wallace D. Wattles, who wrote The Science of Getting Rich. And so that's also my metaphysics. I'm also influenced by some of the metaphysics of the University of Metaphysical Sciences. I'm also influenced by some of the metaphysics that Sean Carroll talks about. But very specifically, I have this perspective of metaphysics that should be, I believe, informed by mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics. That you don't need to be an expert on all of them, but you should have a very solid grounding on physics before you dare to say where physics, mainstream physics ends, and what they're not talking about and what they don't get. Because how do you know that if you don't understand the fundamentals of physics? How can you say that? How can you say that they don't know what they're talking about? And again, a lot of people who are studying advanced sciences and have advanced degrees, as I've given some examples, like Francis Collins, who worked in genetics, or my associate friend Arissa, who went to MIT and works on Mars Science Laboratory, JPL, and various other people that I met. You know, they study science, but they're still open mind. Their mind is still open to other possibilities. So, but it seemed like the closed-mindedness was on the other side. And I'm not saying that it is. You know, there's also a lot of, quantum gurus out there who claim quantum everything and don't really know what they're talking about, and they totally misappropriate the observer effect as being an actual observer, when it really is simply the physical interaction with a system to obtain a measurement, and not a conscious observer, as they would have you believe. But I won't get into that. I've already done a talk and even written and published a paper on that just recently, which I'm going to put on ResearchGate within the hour. This is now, 11:28 p.m. and the date is what is today's date? I think it's February 3rd or 4th. Oh my gosh, it's February 6th. All right, yeah. All right, so it's February 6th, 2026. No, March. What am I talking about? February. March 6th, 2026. It's the official 20th year anniversary of my first website, eym.hypnoathletics.com. So yay, happy birthday, hypnoathletics.com. So that's where the meta framework came in. And after I wrote and published my PhD thesis and I received my diploma and it was officially Dr. Hakeem Ali-Bocas Alexander in April of 2024, I then wrote a paper called Axiom of Necessity, in which I further explored more of the meta framework, mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied, and said, look, the only way this can go is then I published the eternality axiom, which basically shows through mainstream science, physics, that the universe is eternal. And I used, in that paper, I mainly talked about one law of conservation, which is the conservation of energy, the first law of thermodynamics, and Einstein's equation E equals mc squared. So the first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's conserved, which I am asserting is synonymous with eternal. If something cannot be created, it means it's always there. If it cannot be destroyed, it means it always will be there. So it just changes from one form to the other. And Einstein's equation has energy at the front, E equals mc squared. E, energy, equals mass times c, which is the speed of light, the constant of light, squared, multiplied by itself. So energy equals mass times that number. So that much mass, the speed of light squared, you can get energy, which is, why Einstein was consulted on with the atomic bomb, as well as several other people, right? So you can get energy from matter, because mass is a measurement of matter, and you can convert matter into energy. Our particle accelerators or atom smashers are doing that. So they're interconvertible. So if energy equals matter or mass times the speed of light squared, then mass is energy. And if energy is eternal, then mass, aka matter, is eternal. And so therefore, because our universe is made of matter, mass, and energy, right, then the universe is in fact eternal, and the Big Bang is simply a specific event within an eternal, boundless universe. And that was what the eternality axiom was. That's the position of my eternality axiom based on the meta framework. And then I recently, in the end of February, published another paper that specifically focused on that mass also has the conservation law. The conservation of mass says the same thing as conservation of energy. Mass cannot be created or destroyed. It just changes form. So that's why E equals mc squared. Both mass and energy they're co-eternal. So I just basically just re-emphasized it with a follow-up paper. But then I also talked about some other things, which I did touch tiny bit on in Eternal Echoes. The first thesis, I talked about subquantum kinetics a little bit, and also an even more fringe field called ontological mathematics. But then I talked a little bit more, and then finally I talked about Fourier transforms, which I did first learn about from the ontological mathematicians, but then I talked about how that is the way that we go from the eternal plenum, the eternal field of potentiality, and how that transforms from that frequency domain into the time domain, which is the physical material world. And so, but again, back to the beginning, that is my story of how I successfully hacked a metaphysical degree and successfully bridged physics with philosophy, metaphysics with empiricism. And I'm continuing to do that work and continuing to see how all of these things are really interconnected, and that I understand the universe as truly being eternal, and there are many, many implications and consequences of that, and a lot of things can be understood from that perspective, and many things can be explained, and a lot of gaps can be filled when we consider that perspective. And that's really all that I can hope for. And the rest of my life, amongst the other things that I do, practicing martial arts and composing music and continuing to write, is going to be dedicated to further making those connections, and also educating myself more and more about everything mathematical, experimental, theoretical, and applied physics, because I'm fascinated by it. And from a person who the advantages and the opportunities that I could have had when I was in high school, and that other people around me were getting, and I was wondering why I didn't understand things, or why I felt like I was being stonewalled, and there were a lot of barriers being put up and a lot of gates being kept. I didn't let that stop me. I self-educated. I continued to read books, and I just forced myself to learn. And there's a lot to learn. The field of physics is complicated, but it's also beautiful, and there's so many stories in it, and it's just a wonderful thing to understand our universe more. The more you understand, the less you're inclined to be fooled by a lot of things. But also it's fascinating. I mean, the theoretical physics lends itself to so much science fiction, which I'm writing a lot of science fiction and fantasy now, and it actually is helpful in creating more robust and convincing stories. And so this is the universe that I'm creating in the world that I live in, and it's a beautiful one. And so this story is meant to inform, encourage, inspire, to edutain. That we don't have to do things like everybody else does. I could have composed my thesis along the lines of what was found directly in the material of the University of Metaphysical Sciences. But instead, I decided to make a stand and deviate and say, if I'm going to earn a degree from here and put this on the record, then I'm going to do it successfully bridging and doing something that I've always wanted to do, where show that metaphysics wasn't just a word that had the word physics in it, but that physics and metaphysics are simply two sides of one eternal coin. And I know that I've successfully done that. I'm Hakeem Ali-Bocas Alexander. Dr. Hakeem Ali-Bocas Alexander, PhD.